This is the CFMOTO 450MT, and I thought when it was announced at EICMA back in 2023 that it looked like exactly what the market had been asking for, an adventure bike that's smaller, lighter, more affordable and less overpowered than some of the fairly hefty beasts that have become all too common in the adventure market. So the question is, now that I've been able to ride it, is the reality as good as it seems on the spec sheet? Well, in this video we'll go through everything that I've learned from borrowing this press bike for the past couple of weeks to find out. Now, I think the thing that got me so hopeful about this bike when I saw it at the show was the fact that the spec looks just ridiculous, quite frankly, for the money. It's got basically all the features you'd expect from a bigger adventure bike, and so we'll talk through some of them nose to tail on the bike. So yeah, 21-inch front wheel, 18 at the rear, so proper off-road specific sizes, and it also takes tubeless tyres with these spokes that lace to the edges, which I think for the majority of riders is going to be more convenient than inner tubes. You've also got a decent 4-piston radially mounted front brake, and moving up from there, KYB branded suspension, and this is fully adjustable, which is super important to getting the ride dialed in when you're intending to take it off-road. Now also you've got 200mm of travel at the front, 200 at the rear, I believe 220mm of ground clearance. And so despite being a relatively modest seat height, you've got enough height to the chassis to get over obstacles. Under the belly of the bike, you've got a bit of a sump guard as well. It's probably not the most hardcore, but it is better than nothing, and it comes for free as standard. And then some fairly wide off-road friendly foot pegs with rubbers that you can remove. So leave them in on the road to keep the vibes down, and then take them out off-road to give you a bit better grip on your boots. Now the foot controls as well, the brake lever and the gear shifter both fold, so it minimizes the chances of them getting damaged if you drop the bike. And then yeah, moving up into the cockpit, there are plenty more features still. So you've got a decent windscreen that's easy to adjust with the little wheels on the side, and it's got a good range of height. And then sitting in behind it, you've got an accessory rail so you can fit a phone mount or a sat nav or something like that. And also there's a little USB port off to the side of the dash that can help you to power such devices. Impressively, it has both USB-A, the more old school type, and USB-C, which is more modern. And it's a nice color TFT display as well that has a few settings in terms of like layouts and auto brightness and the different information that you can display. Within that you've got Bluetooth, so you can connect headsets and your phone, and you can control music and calls and stuff like that. And personally, I think the switchgear is really nicely laid out and easy to use, and another strength of this bike. Off-road riders will be pleased to see there's a switch, which means that you can just disable ABS at the rear and the traction control with just the push of one button. And it also remembers your settings if you switch the bike off and then back on, which can be quite annoying on other bikes. Then you got handguards. Again, like the sump guard, they're probably not the most robust, but they're better than nothing to start. And they've even fitted it with folding mirrors so you can get them out of the way when you're riding off-road and you don't want to catch them on trees and stuff. That's all backed up with a 17.5 litre tank, which I think is fairly generous for a bike of this stature. And there's also a luggage rack at the rear so you could stick a tail bag or a duffel bag or something like that on. And I think that rounds off, like I say, a very impressive feature set for such an affordable price. I think you could probably guess from the sort of equipment it's fitted with and the way that the chassis is set up that this is a really decent bike for riding off-road. I'm not somebody who does a lot of like hardcore trail riding, but I do like to do those roads where you mix in a bit of gravel and stuff like that. And with the wheel sizes and all the suspension travel and the ground clearance, it just easily eats it up and makes you feel really quite confident. Combined with the fact that it's not super powerful and it's relatively light as well, I think it makes for a great first adventure bike or for someone looking to dabble in it, as well as still probably appealing to the more experienced. For someone of my height as well, I'm 175 centimeters or 5'9". The standing position is really quite good. I think if you're a little bit taller, you'll probably want the bars to be further up. But I found it quite natural, especially for these shorter stints where you're mixing it into part of a longer road ride. The only thing that maybe detracted from my enjoyment a bit was the fact that the throttle is a little bit grabby on and off the throttle, and that's where you find yourself when you're riding at lower speeds off-road. And so going over some of the bumpier bits, you do feel a bit of jolting as the engine goes between being a closed throttle and then back onto that initial part of the throttle travel. But you can smooth it out with a bit of clutch, and I also found that the more you got used to the throttle, the more you could fine-tune your action. The other thing I noticed as well is, despite feeling pretty confident on this bike, the fork is just a little bit too firm as standard. And so it kind of feels like it's hopping and skipping and jumping over some of the rougher surfaces where you want it to soak it up a little bit more. Thankfully, like I say though, it is adjustable and you can back off the damping on the fork. And I found with a little bit of a change there, it massively improved the situation and got it into the sort of range where I found it acceptable. Another thing I really enjoyed with this bike as well is the general sort of feel of the engine. Despite that slight abruptness on and off the throttle, it's just got a really nice character to it, a deep note at the exhaust. And it's especially refreshing in this sort of 400 to 500cc range, where the other bikes from the likes of Kawasaki and Honda that are parallel twins use a 180-degree crank, which I don't think has the same visceral feel to it. The 270-degree crank in this one gives it more of the V-twin flavor. And so yeah, I think it's your only option if you want that sort of engine, but under 500 cc's in the adventure market. Everything else gets the 180 crank, or the singles like the Himalayan or the 390 Adventure, and I think this would be one of the biggest reasons for me to choose this bike over the competition. Riding more so on the road, well, it handles as you'd expect. It does have that off-road bias, so it's not naturally the most sharp feeling at the front end with a 21-incher. And also, I wouldn't say these standard tyres are particularly brilliant either. They're not offering bags of grip, but it's still pleasant enough, and I think if you did upgrade the tyres and got the suspension settings dialed as well for that particular riding, then it would be really quite enjoyable. Realistically, it's not necessarily going to respond to being absolutely thrashed, but if you ride in a sort of smooth but brisk manner, then you can have a very nice time on it through the sort of twisties. And again, the character of the engine, although it's not the quickest at about 42 horsepower, 42 newton meters of peak torque, you know, those sort of moderate back road or country road speeds really does come to the fore for me and stands out as one of this bike's best points. Really, for me, there are just a couple of caveats with this bike, and one of them would be that power figure and how it sort of feels when you're doing motorway riding and if you were planning to tour. I think they've given it fairly short gearing to make it feel quite lively still, despite not being the most powerful bike. And so yeah, while it does the trick when you're accelerating out of corners and stuff like that, it does mean, as a sort of trade-off, that it is working quite hard when you get to motorway speeds. At 70 miles an hour, it's doing just under 7,000 RPM, and it redlines 1,000 or 2,000 RPM higher up than that. So I think probably top speed is going to be under 100 miles per hour, maybe around 95. For me, it just feels like it's working a little bit too hard to be truly comfortable, and also it doesn't really have the ability to do those brisk overtakes, which can sometimes make you feel safer to get out of harm's way. Then if you were wanting to take luggage or a passenger, you know, obviously it's going to struggle even more. And so if you're looking for something that does more so the touring side of adventure riding, then this probably realistically isn't going to be the best option. Everything else, I think it does really quite well, but a motorway mile muncher, it is not. Then there's just a couple of things about the ergonomics that I don't absolutely love. I mean, one of the strengths I said about it was this 17.5 litre fuel tank, which really is quite generous. But one of the downsides is they've made it pretty wide between your legs. And I'd say actually, at this point, it's wider than quite a lot of bigger bikes like the Africa Twin. That just means that standing up, you feel like your legs are pushed apart the more you slide forward. And so yeah, that's something I'd like to see updated perhaps for the next version. And then the other is the fact that the seat height is, I think personally, a little bit too low. Now you can change one of the bolts on the rear shock linkage and that'll set it between either 800 or 820 millimeters, but what that's not going to change is the relationship between the bars, the pegs and the seat, or the rider triangle as you might call it. Naturally, as I say, with all that suspension travel and ground clearance, this is quite a tall bike, and so the foot pegs are a decent way off the floor. And again, the bars have to be fairly high up in order to facilitate that standing riding position. But I think being in the 400 to 500 class, they didn't want to make the seat height too big in case it alienated some newer riders or shorter riders that might be interested in this sort of bike. And so yeah, they've kept it really quite low, and that does mean you can flat foot it very easily, even if you're not particularly tall like myself. The big downside is that it just feels too low to me in relation to the pegs and the bars. So with your knee angle, it's a little too tight and you almost feel like you're squatting. And then with the bars, they feel very much up above where the seat is and you're really sat down in the bike as opposed to a more natural riding position. The solution for this one though should be pretty simple, because when I googled it, it looks like there's a rally seat available and that's another 100 quid or so as an accessory, and that adds another 50 millimeters, which is quite a lot, but I do think that'll put it in a more familiar place in relation to the rest of the ergonomics if you're comfortable with riding taller bikes or you're more experienced with adventure bikes. Still, for some other people, I think that is going to be one of this bike's strengths. If you like the look of a Tenere 700 or you like the idea of it, then this offers a lot of the same image, riding experience, some of the off-road capabilities, but just in a lighter package and with a much lower seat height. So yeah, if you like the idea of this more affordable version of a T7, then definitely check one of these out. But then the other potential audience for this bike, I suppose, is anyone who was considering one of the other smaller capacity adventure bikes on the market, like the Himalayan and the 390 Duke that I talked about earlier. So is this the one to go for? Well, I think for me, out of those three bikes in particular, given how good it looks as well, but also that parallel twin engine with the 270-degree crank, for me personally, I think this would have to be the one I'd choose. I really have enjoyed riding it. It's just the sound and feel of the engine that's really satisfying, and it's a prime example of one of those bikes where, you know, they say it's more fun to ride a slow bike fast than a fast bike slow. Well, that's exactly how I felt when it comes to this bike. As long as you're not planning on doing any big motorway tours, and if you upgrade the tyres and maybe fit that rally seat, then considering what you're getting for the money, I really do think it's a fantastic buy. As always though, I'd love to know what you think of it, so do let me know down in the comments below, and also which bike out of the ones I've mentioned would you choose? If you like the look of the Enfield, then I'll stick my full review of that on the screen now as well, so you can give that a click and give it a watch in case you haven't already. Do hit subscribe as well if you want to see more of the latest motorcycle reviews like this right here on MOTOBOB. A massive thanks for watching today, and we'll see you in the next video.